your best food plots, if somebody's like, hey, and there's no right or wrong answer here, and a lot of this is subjective, and there's going to be 20 guys that disagree with me and 20 that agree, or somebody has a different spin. But everything that we're doing here, everything we're talking about, there's always just multiple ways to accomplish it. There's not going to be one right answer. I mean, and you have so many variables, from soil types to climate to what are your goals? Why is the food plot there? What time of year is it there for? What equipment do you have? So clearly there's so many variables, but there's also so many ways to solve one problem. Like, hey, I want to get clover established. There's a million ways to do this. So the number one food plot for somebody starting out:
Lights,
camera,
follow the trail.
ready to shoot.
If you know where a deer's bedding and you know where he's eating, that deer should be dead.
Camera.
If you're passive on a deer, what you're doing is you're teaching them.
I've got 30 bucks in the Michigan record book. Everyone but one has had at least one previous wound on his body. Some had as many as 4.
The Exodus Podcast,
Your source for all things whitetail.
Skip, welcome to the Exodus Podcast. How you doing?
Good, great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Stay at home today.
Yeah, that's what's been. Have you been spending a lot of time at Capitol Hill here recently?
Yeah, so that one winded down. It's kind of like hunting season. So that was legislative season, and we were hunting the bad bills. And we got our bag limit. We got the people of Iowa got 9 out of 9 or 8 out of 9 or 10 out of 10, whatever, all of them. We got every one of them killed, and that's the people versus the lobbyists and the money and the few sellout politicians. So that hunting season went really, really well. It was like success. Equivalent to deer hunting, you'd be like, yep, I got a couple 200-inch deer this year.
Pretty humble season. So, that's excellent.
Yeah, that season ended. I'm kind of glad. And it is a season. All this legislative stuff is a season. So the bills we wanted killed are killed. And now, right when all this finishes, now it's dry out. The sun's out. I mean, it's time to go. We got some corn and beans in the ground and everything else like that I do in the winter, which we'll talk about later. I got all that stuff done. So things are really teed up nice this year. The year is going well so far.
That's good.
There will be monkey wrenches. But it's going great so far.
That's good. Did you ever think you would be at Capitol Hill working to keep Iowa a premier state?
Absolutely not. The same. I would give the same response if somebody said, did you ever think you'd be farming and managing farms and doing habitat and not having a job like for a person? I'd be like, no, that's not possible. Did you think you'd ever be talking to politicians and lobbyists and all that? No, that one was out of the blue, but just for like, I'd say it goes back 6 or 7 years. No, it probably goes back 10 years that I've been really interested in this stuff. And then it just grew. And then finally it grew to a point where, I was writing a lot on it and I was doing videos on it. So before I would just write about all these things, and I wrote articles. I wrote an article on Michigan when I was in my 20s that went crazy. But this is before Facebook. I mean, it went crazy, where I just laid out all the problems of Michigan. And so I've always loved that topic, and I've loved trying to see places get better that are in really dire shape. So I guess it's a natural progression that I didn't see coming, but I wrote on it, then I did videos on it, and then different people would be like, hey, can I meet with you on this? Okay, yep, let's sit down. And they want to understand a lot of these issues. And then different groups, all sorts of different groups, like the lobbyists or House members or Senate members or an organization would say, hey, would you go and discuss this issue at the Capitol? And then it's like, hey, would you, can you get in depth? Can you go back and forth with this stuff? And I said, yeah, I know the information. So it was fun. I mean, it was fun because, you're going there with truth, in my opinion, and it's not opinion. You're just going there with truth, with facts, without a bias against these people who all have these special interest bias. And it's just a great time. I mean, and we won in people don't always win, but yeah, it was a fantastic learning experience, and I don't know where it'll end. I mean, do you want to go into politics? No. No, leave my farm and go into that. No, thank you. No, thank you. I'll visit there. I'll visit there, and that's where it stops.
Yeah, we were just talking too,
but
which I think it's a cool illustration for people who sometimes feel helpless. That it is what it is. Whatever the state decides is just the world we're going to live in. But I think what that shows is if there is organized effort on the hunter side, that there can be an impact. You felt very bullish that things can get done in every state.
Totally different than 20 years ago. So any person listening to this in any state, if you can get 20 guys on board, even with a group text message and maybe a little Facebook page or something where you can say, these are the bills coming out. And then those people, every one of them's like, hey, I'm going to contact everybody I know. And then you had an organized fashion to say, we're going to, whatever, here's the bills that are being proposed, and catch it early. And there is a way to catch it early. And then just get organized and be like, hey, these are the bills being proposed. Now let's get the word out on Facebook or Instagram or your website or whatever, or text message. I don't care what it is. Just get the word out, and 10 people, 20 people, 50 people. If you start there, you could get all this stopped and you could get things working in your favor. The people writing in and the people getting organized will defeat the lobbyists, the special interests, and a lot of money and a few sellout politicians the vast majority of the time if you do it correctly. And, you know, you might have a couple years of learning this where you're like, hey, this legislative season didn't go so well, but the next one's due, and you'll just get more organized. And then it's a machine that is just well oiled and firing on all cylinders, and you can be just extremely effective, where 20, 30 years ago it was so much harder to organize. So absolutely, there's more opportunity to change things now for people to get organized. And I'd be far more optimistic about changing your state now than I would be 20 or 30 years ago. That's
awesome. How you mentioned there's a way to catch things early. Is that a government website? Is that in the world of politics? I think they're called the deep throat. Something that tells you, like, I know in Watergate that was a thing.
Yeah. So you gotta have somebody who's connected to the system. This is not that complicated. This is very simple stuff. Maybe you reach out to, like in Iowa, we have the Natural Resources Committee, which is several people in the Senate that are on this committee. And if you just said, hey, if you ask one of them, hey, where can I get the information on all the new bills that are, they work for you. How do I get the information on time for all the bills that are coming out? And just get one connection and ask them. It's as simple as that. And as long as you have a reliable source that says, yep, here's the list. And then maybe they emailed you and said, hey, these are the 10 bills being proposed this year that have to do with the outdoors. It's as simple as that. It's very easy. Mm-hmm. You just need somebody to just go through very simple steps to figure this out. And it's super easy. And I didn't know this stuff 10 years ago. I had no clue. I'm like, where do I start? I don't know how any of this works. It's not complicated. Mm-hmm. It's not complicated. So just, if you're a little bit ambitious, which a lot of these guys in their 20s and 30s are fiery ambitious. They're great. And they're the reason they stopped all this stuff in Iowa. A lot of 20 and 30-year-olds stopped this. They'll figure it out really easily. And then once you have that down, which takes 10, 20 minutes of research on how to get the information, now it's just getting organized. And again, that's not that hard either. How hard is it to start a Facebook group?
Yeah.
Not hard.
Yeah.
And then just, hey guys, get on this. Really do something though. Really act.
Yeah.
And it works.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
so now it's farm season, it's habitat season.
Yeah. Which I'll just say this too. I know you put out the list of emails to reach out and, some points to hit on. I sent out an email to the folks in Iowa, and I was surprised with the amount of thorough responses I got too. Not just thanks for your reply. They're like, hey, thank you for reaching out. I'm not a hunter, but I wanted to, I'm learning more about this, and it's always great to get perspective from dedicated hunters. Like, that was a general consensus.
Unbelievably effective. Thank you. Thank you to everybody else that did it. Ongoing. Write an email to these folks, make it concise, make it personal and passionate. You're informed about these issues. You know about these issues. They don't. And that's why they responded to you, because they're sitting there going, well, I don't hunt. It's great to hear from hunters because we usually don't. And in the past, they hadn't at all. And that's
cool.
How this changed. They're like, we don't hear from hunters at all. We just hear from 10 angry farmers. So now they hear from hunters, and they're not hunters. And they're like, man, I didn't realize that. I mean, all of them, when I talk to them, like, really, I didn't realize that. Other states aren't good. I'm like, no. Like, but Wisconsin's got all that forest and stuff. It's got to be way better than Iowa. I'm like, no. So they just don't know. They're not hunters. 99% are not hunters, and they're certainly not hardcore hunters at that. So they want to hear from you guys.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And you're mentioning it's farming season, and for a lot of folks, that kind of means developing a food plot plan. And I really want to dive into food plots, because I think there's a ton of information out there. There's probably some level of analysis by paralysis of, what do I plant? What do I really need to do? I planted some food plots, it sucked, or I planted these and they didn't eat it. So there's a lot of things that tie into that. And how many years of dedicated food plot experience do you have? Because what I really enjoy following on the Iowa Whitetail Forum is I feel you're always optimizing and testing new things and not getting stuck in one way. Is that an accurate?
Yeah, for sure. I don't have it all figured out.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the other day was like, hey man, how do I plant sandfoin? I'm like, why? And they're like, well, I'm out west. I'm like, okay, sandfoin, and I'm like, I haven't done it. I can figure it out. But yeah, so I've been doing like hardcore food plots, like where I'm like, I want a successful plot. They weren't always successful. Many times they were not. I'd say for like 25 years. Now, hardcore 25 years. Now, when I was 14 and I think it was my first year hunting. Food plots were big then, and so I'm 44. So that was 30 years ago. So I didn't know what I was doing at all. So I went into town. I said, hey, I hear about this food plot stuff at the seed store. And he goes, yeah, it's really good. I said, what do I do? He goes, well, I think you should do sugar beets. I said, okay, what do I do? He goes, you buy this bag of sugar beets. Well, I went into the woods with my rake, and I raked in the woods. I raked up this area, maybe, I don't know, maybe the size of people's driveway or twice the size of their driveway. It was maybe a 100th of an acre or a 50th of an acre. I spread my sugar beet seeds and raked over them, and I came back like a month later. I'm like, there's nothing growing. It was in the forest. It was totally shaded out. No fertilizer, no herbicide. In the forest. That's how dumb I was. Yeah, I didn't grow a sugar beet. Not even like, hey man, there's one that's the size of a marble.
Yeah.
Nothing.
So
that was when I was 14. My first successful food plot at probably 20. So 22.
Yeah, and at 14 years old too, when you're spending money on seed and you don't have anything fruitful come out of it, you're like, man, that was a waste of money. That was a waste of effort. And so
it was a total waste, but it was just seed and a rake.
Yeah.
And I got probably a little bit of a head start because we had a big yard growing up in the city, and I always wanted to have a garden. So since I was maybe like 8 or 9 years old, I started doing a garden, and then I would try all these new things. And by the time I'm like 14 or 15, like I'm bringing beans over to my neighbors, which are clearly easy to grow, but I didn't know how to do that stuff. And they're like, hey, you're really good at gardening. You can grow stuff. There's other things I'm terrible at, but I was good at gardening. And I'm bringing my neighbors tomatoes and beans and peas, and then we're having dinner with lettuce that I grew in my garden. And I was just kind of good at it from a young age. Or not necessarily that I was good at it. I just really liked it, so I figured it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
I have a garden now. I can look out my window. I have a garden, and I have a little tree nursery in my backyard in the city. I'm kind of in town here. And I have this giant like cage tree nursery. I mean, I could even take the computer and show you guys, but and I'll grow tree seedlings in there and then bring them back to my farm later and plant them. So I'm always messing with stuff year round.
Yeah.
Year round, collecting seeds in the middle of the winter.
Mm-hmm. That's fun. So I guess kind of diving right into it, if this is probably a question that most people have, and I know it's very high level and it's so situational as everything, but just a blanket answer is like, what have you seen be some of the best food plots for whitetails? Which, once again, very high level. But
Yeah.
if there was a kind of a canned answer that would spin things off.
Yeah. So there's a way to do this. And that's what I try and do with anybody who's starting out. Like, listen, I understand things at extremely, like, I understand. I mean, I farm. I want to know stuff that, like, I mean, getting into micros and pHs and organic matter and all that stuff. I can do that, but I'm trying to break this down to a simplistic level. So, your best food plots, if somebody's like, hey, and there's no right or wrong answer here, and a lot of this is subjective, and there's going to be 20 guys that disagree with me and 20 that agree, or somebody has a different spin. But, so I'll just give you a few thoughts on what works for me. And then one thing I want to start out with is everything that we're doing here, everything we're talking about, there's always just multiple ways to accomplish it. There's not going to be one right answer. I mean, and you have so many variables, from soil types to climate to what are your goals? When do you want to, why is the food plot there? What time of year is it there for? What equipment do you have? So clearly there's so many variables, but there's also so many ways to solve one problem. Like, hey, I want to get clover established. There's a million ways to do this. So, the number one food plot for somebody starting out would probably be clover. It's easy. It can tolerate a wide range of soil conditions. It's probably the most year-round utilized food source you're going to have. Do I do just clover? No. But if somebody said, I'm going to start out with one thing and I can only do one thing and my skills are very minimal, clover is probably the best thing to start with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so before we get much further into what to plant, I think it would be good to discuss where these food plots ideally should go. Because I think some people are like, oh, that's an open spot on the back part of the farm. That's where I'm going to put my food plot. What is the architecture, or I guess cardinal rules of food plot placement that we should cover as well?
Don't put them into places where the deer are going to be disturbed frequently. So, if you got a hunting spot that you want to hunt on, just make sure it's a spot that the deer feel very comfortable, and you're not disturbing it. Disturbance of food plots is probably the number one issue. Don't have it at like an access point. Like, and this is common sense, and so I'm just going to go over this really, really quick.
I think a lot of people put it where they can. So
worth mentioning.
Yeah.
Like, hey, my path into my farm, and I drive back in there all the time, don't have a food plot right next to that, where every time you go in there, you're going next to your food plot. It has to be a safe, secluded, sanctuary-like type situation where the deer, like, I always feel comfortable being in this food plot. It's safe, and, I have good escape cover right by, and I'm not getting messed with all the time. So I would say that is number one. If it's a hunting plot, again, just have it in a place that you're not going to be disturbing it. And I would have it set up so you can leave that food plot, shape it in a way, or put it in a place so when you're hunting, you can get out of there. Maybe the food plot kind of, snakes out 100 yards away, and you're like, hey, the deer naturally start here, but they always move. And then by the time it's dark, usually they're at the end of that, and then I can slip out without being detected. That's just another huge pressure element, because I'm, if I put one food plot on my farm, and I'm like, I'm going to hunt that 10 times, which I can't think any scenario I'd even do that. But if I was, and it's like, every one of the 10 times the deer are just right in front of me, and then I spook them every time, don't plant that food plot, because you're just going to do almost more harm than good.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're going to ruin the spot.
Let's say they're limited to where they could put food on that farm, and it is on closer to the entrance. Can you get away with screening it effectively where you can get in and out and around it, or do you think that it's too high risk?
No, you can. You could do a plot screen every year fundamentally. Something like Egyptian wheat or a sorghum mix, anything like that. That would work. And even if you do that, I would just be like, okay, I know that food plot's there, it's screened, and I'm just going to avoid that spot. I'm just going to make a cognizant effort to skirt around it, to not go by it like right when it's getting dark. Don't just leave it alone as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But yes, I that's doable.
Okay. And so it sounds like, from what I'm picking up too, I think most people, I shouldn't say, there's a handful of folks out there that when they put a food plot in, that's their marquee hunting location. Like that's, so I have a food plot, so I'm going to hunt over it. Do you think overall people overhunt food plots, like just from a general behavior standpoint?
For sure.
And that's a big mistake.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think if I say it how it is, I'd say 75% of hunting tactics are incorrect or have some major flaws in them. And I don't want to say that at all like disrespectfully or coming across like a jerk, but I just think most people do it. They make a lot of mistakes and they don't even realize they're making them. Mm-hmm. So yes, no, if I had 80 acres with 2 food plots and I'm like, that's my go-to, I'm just going to hunt the food plots over and over and over and over. It's a mistake. Mm-hmm. It's a mistake. Unless you had a situation where you're like, hey, I do only hunt it with this wind, and I'm telling you, I can get in and out without getting busted at all. And that's pretty rare to see somebody that can accomplish that. It can happen, but pretty rare. And you know, if you have 2 food plots on an 80 acres or something, and I've had an 80 acres like that where it's like, hey, there's 2 food plots on it. Well, I still limit it, and I'm going to other places, and I just hunt it so little, and then in the mornings, I don't go hunt those food plots. You know, so if you're hunting those little food plots in the morning, you're crazy, in my opinion. You're ruining your ground fast.
Uh-huh. Would you ever, or have you, I think some people may think this is ludicrous, but would you ever plant a food plot knowing you will never hunt over it? But
absolutely.
Okay. So walk through a situation where that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so I'll frame it here. My goal is to protect young deer. Whether you like it or not, whether you're into that or not, I am. I want to protect young deer. I don't want them running all over the place and not having what they need on my farm. So then they're going to other farms, and a good genetic 2-year-old that's got kickers all over the place, or a 3-year-old or something, I'm like, oh, I want to keep that deer safe. I'm not going to shoot him. I don't want to give him any reason to leave. So I'll have lots of diverse food sources, mainly in the center of my farm, and I do not hunt on them. And if the deer go out there and feed, and there's a mature buck that I want to shoot that's going there, that's okay. I'm not going to get them there. I'm not. But I want food sources on my farm that keep them in there. And I want the movement kind of, if I could choose, and sometimes you can't, most of the time you can't, but I want them to move into my farm. I want them to keep moving in as opposed to going out. So I want them moving in. And those are where my food plots are, is in the center of my farm. It might be like, hey, kind of in the middle of my timber, I got a big opening and I created a food plot, and I'll never hunt it. But it keeps a lot of deer safe, and it keeps them safe. It keeps them healthy. And then that 3-year-old that I'm like, you know, I hope he makes it. He just has a far better chance of reaching maturity if where he feeds is in the center of my farm, and he's not constantly going out to my neighbor's place, that if there was a neighbor that would shoot a deer like that. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, basically give them a free meal so they want to stay there and eat when they're most vulnerable.
It's a freebie.
Yeah.
It's a freebie.
Yeah. Okay.
I've got one on my farm. It's really good, but and I've been tempted a few times. I'm like, man, I want to go sneak over there and hunt it. And that's clearly like a luxury type situation to be like, hey, and this one's like two acres that I don't hunt. And I understand most people are going to be like, hey, I'm working with 40 acres here. I can do one food plot. I can't do that. But, you know, if you did have something in the center of your farm and you're like, hey, it's a 1/4 acre clover plot or something, and I really can't hunt on it. Will that hurt me? No, I think it will help you, because you're not just out there to kill things. You're also trying to keep things safe, keep things healthy, and keep things alive for another year, so more deer have a better chance of reaching maturity. And that's why I do it. I want more deer to be able to reach maturity, and that's probably the number one reason there isn't mature bucks on a farm, is because they don't stay there and they leave, and somebody else shoots them when they're extremely young. I mean, I'd say that's the number one reason why there isn't mature bucks across the whole country.
Yeah. I mean, that's fact. So some key notes. Number one is don't put the food plot where you're going to have to disturb it in and out consistently. Second one would be don't be afraid if you're putting a food plot where you can't hunt over it. Is there any other cardinal rules that people need to really follow? Because someone right now is probably looking at their map right now while they listen, and they're like, well, I could maybe get one back there. And so I just trying to help people do a little bit more effective due diligence before they break ground.
Yeah, I mean, there's another one, splitting hairs a little bit, but worth mentioning, or low hanging fruit rather, where it's kind of obvious, but I'll still say it. Like, if you did have a neighbor that is extremely problematic, that they bring in 20 guys and just every buck that hops the fence, they shoot it, and that's against what you're trying to do. Don't put your food plots where it directs them that way, because deer, when they come into a food plot, they don't stay there very long. I don't care what's there. They're there for maybe 30 minutes, maybe 45, maybe an hour at the very most. They move through and they go on to something else. And a lot of times that's, okay, there's an ag field over there and they're hopping fences. So, ideally, if I had a food plot way away from some of my problematic neighbors, and I knew that, an hour before dark, they're going to be there. And by the time they even were walking, even if they went that direction, it's going to be pitch black. But by the time they got to the neighbors, that's a great scenario.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point of, once again, buying the deer time when they probably could get shot. So another instance where you do put it on the edge of the property, because that's the open spot and that's where I can put it. You're probably doing more damage long-term for the age class than help. And so let's walk through that scenario. So someone's listening like, well, I only have one spot to put a food plot and I have a 40. Would they be better off to make that open area into more dense habitat and try to squeeze out a micro plot somewhere else?
That's what I do. If it was next to like a really problematic neighbor, I would turn that into something else. Maybe it's cover, maybe it's something not desirable. Maybe I just let it go. And, and one idea would be like, okay, if you got timber, find an area that's flat in that timber and that has some good soil, and spend $1,000 clearing it out, or maybe even a couple $1,000 clearing it out, so you can have a plot there where it's a desirable location. And then if I ever destroy habitat just because I'm just an environmental nut. If I ever destroy an area, like, hey, I'm going to put a food plot here and I'm going to take out some trees, I try and do like junky trees, stuff like that. But then I'll try and fix, if I ruin 2 acres by clearing it out, I'll try and fix like 3 or 4 to make up for it. Mm-hmm. So just
good rule of thumb.
Side little fussy point of mine.
No,
I've always been just conservation, environmental nut since I was a little kid. So I hate destroying cover. And if I ever do, I want to make it up twofold in some other way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so that 2 acre plot in the middle of your farm, what comprises that food plot? What are you putting in there?
Okay, really, well, I was going to say really simple, but it's not. So I will go into that 2 acre plot like when I started it, and I think I started if I started in the spring or the winter, I think I seeded this one down all clover. Okay, all clover. So in the spring, the clover was coming up and I kept it mowed. And then in July and August, I transitioned about 80% of that. I left 20% into clover, and then I took about Oh, yeah. I took, so of the ground that was left, I took half of that and I turned it into brassicas around July 29. I would say July, rain or shine, July 29 for brassicas, roughly. I like going a little bit earlier now just because of weather, and we can get into that later. But so half of it goes into brassicas, the half remaining, and then half of it goes into a rye mix, which is like rye, oats, peas, radish, and if there's any area where I'm like, hey, I do want, I'll still add, I'll even add clover there. Like, hey, you killed off some clover and that fixes nitrogen. So you got a lot of nitrogen now. And then you plant this rye mix, I'll add clover back into it. So next spring, it's clover again. So it'll have three things, 20% clover, and then the remaining half of it is brassicas in one half, which would be like
40% of it,
radish and purple top turnips. And I've done canola. I've done kale. I've done all sorts of other stuff, but I fundamentally like radishes and purple top turnips. And then on the other half, I do the rye mix that I just said. And then those two areas that I just mentioned, then I just flip-flop them every other year, just like a corn and bean rotation. And that's good for reducing your costs, reducing herbicide use, keeping weeds at bay, and disease. And disease is a big one with any plant. If you go plant the same thing over and over and over and over and over, I don't care what it is, corn, beans, anything, you're going to start having problems, whether it's insects, fungus, whatever, you're going to have issues. So we're rotating those, and they complement each other perfectly.
Mm-hmm. In that plot, are you trying to do no-till, or are you going in and working the ground? Or obviously you've been doing it for a while, so it's probably a little bit different than what most people are listening right now and starting out with.
Yeah, so the only times I'll do tillage is if like, hey, it's just a mess with just all these, it's not level and it's all this nasty sod. I might till it once. Now, if a guy says, listen, I don't have the means to do no-till, now there is methods to do things no-till even without like a drill. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I like to do no-till after that, after it's smoothed out, and by doing and now I can just drill it, so it's very simple. But yeah, no tillage, and if the guy doesn't have a drill, you can still do a lot with like, I started out with a harrow, and you can do a lot with that. I'm not going to say that's no-till, but it's very minimal. You can do a lot with that. You can do a lot with a roller, like a cultipacker. Yeah. I use a cultimulcher. It's got these little tines, and then, with two rollers, and it does a fantastic job. So what I would say, if you don't have the equipment to do no-till, though, just reduce your tillage, for any of these things we're talking about, you do not need to go roto-till your ground 8 and 10 inches deep. You're ruining your soil. I'm just going to say it how it is. You're ruining your soil. Do not do that. My buddies with rotary tillers, my friends have them. Like, what do you think? I'm like, I think that thing needs to be sold for scrap. Why? It's horrible for the ground. But it's horrible. The erosion.
Yeah. But people like
you're planting things that need to go maybe 1 inch deep, and a lot of them 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch. You do not need to till things up 6, 8, 10 inches. Do not need to do it. And what that's doing to the soil is destroying it. And you do that for 10 years, if there's any erosion or anything, especially, even without erosion, it's horrible for the soil. Just avoid that one. So like a light disc, just shallow. Just think of how deep your seeds are going to go. If your seeds are only going to go a 1/2 inch deep, I mean, you could disc 1 inch or 2, but you certainly don't need to go more than that. So just minimize the tillage, go shallow, get a lot of seeds growing so you do not have erosion issues, because erosion is a huge issue that is overlooked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 2 things on that. I think people like the aesthetic of freshly worked dirt, and they like the smell of it. Yeah. And so they feel
absolutely.
When they step back, when they step back, they're like, oh man, this looks great. And when you do I did no-till last year on my plots, and they look ugly in comparison to freshly worked dirt. I had really good success with it. And maybe it's in the eye of the planter of what looks ugly and what doesn't. But
Wait, which one? And there's some downsides to no-till. There's some more There is some more problems that people can get into with no-till. The seed bed clearly it's not quite as good. There's reasons people do tillage. So, but there's a way to get really successful results. I mean, what was the difference with your plots when you did the no-till versus the tillage? Was the results better in one or the other?
For this particular plot, I can't compare tillage to. I just went straight up no-till. It was old remnant prairie of cattle ground, and so I'm sure the micronutrients in it was really great because I had the best brassica plot I've ever had, and I no-tilled it, and it was tall, nasty weeds. Went and mowed it, let it grow up, sprayed it, planted some buckwheat, and then I crimped it all in there and overseeded it, and it worked really well.
Yeah, and somebody who goes into like a pasture or something where cows have been there for 20, 30 years and they find the good quality soil, and cows have been just just years of manure on there, and the microbiology under the soil, the whole ecology of the soil is so good that they're like, oh my gosh, that first year is amazing. And then it kind of goes tick, 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 tick down because they don't keep up with all that stuff. So we want to mimic that in a way. I mean, there's a reason it's so good the first year when you take like cattle pasture out. That's rich soil that's been sitting there for 20 years.
Yep.
It produces a fantastic crop. I mean, when you put corn or beans into that too, your first year is going to be your best year usually.
So what do you do the following years to continue having great success, or is it just an anomaly for that first year as you kind of deplete some?
No, you can maintain it. So when you have your soil tests, you even with situations like that, they're going to be depleted on certain things. So it might be pH. It might be, hey, my pH is too low. It might be, what happens is when you start working that soil up, all the bacteria, all the fungus starts dying off in that soil at some level. And then the earthworms die because you're disking them up and you're tearing them to pieces. So all these holes and the whole, it's ecology. It's a whole system. So you're just disrupting the whole system. So you go, okay, how can I eliminate that disruption? Don't till it. And then find out what that soil is missing. Okay. It's missing lime because my pH is 5.5. Okay. Fix that. And then, another one, a big one, if you keep disking it and erodes, you might start out with, hey, my organic matter was 4% when I started. 10 years later, it's 3% or 2%. You just, that's how things go downhill fast. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to increase our organic matter from whatever we found it. We're trying to build that up, and then we're trying to keep the soil ecology as close to what we found it in those like virgin situations as we can, and then just correct the elements that are problematic. The pH. Hey, it's missing sulfur. It's missing whatever, and that's where soil test comes in. Just fix those missing pieces and don't wreck your soil. That's as simple as I can make it. Fix the missing pieces on your soil test and don't ruin the soil. And actually, if you do those things like rotate it, no-till, which is essentially cover crops. You could say, well, farmers are doing cover crops and they're doing blends. What is that? That's what they're doing. They're building their organic matter, and that's building the soil ecology. So that's why it's important to flip-flop those things. And that'll make it even better than what you found it. It'll bring your organic matter up.
Mm-hmm. So there's people, I'm sure, listening. They're like, man, that sounds like a lot of work. I don't really know much about it. Is it worth the effort, in your opinion?
Oh yeah. Because it's still work to do it the wrong way. It's more work to do it the wrong way
with less results.
Yeah, it's more work. Hey man, I went and dissed that thing 50 times, and I got that. I deep ripped it and I rototilled it, and then nobody's really doing that, but like disking it and then coming back and smoothing it out. That's a lot of work. So it's less work to not do a lot of that stuff. Now, and then somebody's like, well, then the trade-off is I got to have a no-till drill. Okay. Which is a cost. And then there's some more obstacles around no-till, like, depth is a big one. And if you have residue on top, how do you deal with that? And herbicides. and you still have possible herbicide use with tillage, probably more with tillage. You have more weeds when you're tearing up that soil. You have more weed pressure. So if you want to use less herbicides, rotate things. Don't tear that soil up. So, there is many ways to do things without a no-till drill, like I said before. And I would say if somebody's like, okay, because I started out with a 4-wheeler, and I got this is on a budget. I got a harrow from Tractor Supply, and I just drive that thing around and around and around, just scratch the soil. Well, it created a pretty nice, a nice seed bed, and I had it killed with herbicide. And then I could go back with other herbicides later. So that was pretty cheap. If I could do it over again, if I had that situation, I probably would get I would just get a cultipacker that I could drag around, and I would kill the vegetation off the top. And then I would, maybe you could even cultipack it once, seed it, and cultipack it again. You don't really need to. You could probably just seed it and cultipack over it. Well, if you have a cultipacker, you technically could pull that with your truck. A small one, you could, if it was just the type that just got pulled in your very basic level, you could pull that with your truck. If you don't have even that, then you're that now we're talking about the classic, which we've heard a million times, like the throw and grow. Well, there's some ways to do throw and grow. And I would say the number one ways to do throw and grow would be frost seeding clover. And then your next best way to do throw and grow would be to burn off your area you want to plant with herbicides. I personally would not do fire because I like that matting on the top. I like the organic matter on the top. I personally wouldn't do fire. A lot of people out there do it. I would not. And then I guess it can't be too thick. So maybe if it's a thick mat, like, hey, this is just carpet, nothing's getting through there, sure. Maybe fire is a tool. And your downside with that is you're losing some organic matter, and you're losing some almost like mulch on the top that'll keep the soil cooler, and it'll keep it from drying out. That's why I like having at least a little duff on top. But you can basically just seed into that certain seeds. Certain things will grow and certain things won't grow. Clovers will grow. Any of your small, hard seeds generally will grow well. Clovers, all your brassicas, winter rye. Second you start to do things on top like winter peas, oats, not real effective. Some people might say they are, but not real effective. Soybeans, okay. You'd kind of have to scratch the soil, but you could possibly do soybeans too. But I would say your hard small seeds are going to be your best bet for something like a throw and grow.
Mm-hmm. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to walk through 3 different types of habitat managers. And so these are going to be the bare necessity tools for each category. And you kind of touched on the guy that's probably just getting started out with a cultipacker. I assume a sprayer, a bag, like a bag spreader.
Yeah,
and
those red bags, man, I still use them today. Yeah, they're great.
So as far as a guy that just wants to start his first food plot this year on the most lowest budget possible, we're talking a 1/4 acre plot or 1/2 acre plot, maybe 2 acres if you're really ambitious, like a cultipacker, a sprayer, and a red bag to seed.
Yep.
Is there any other tools?
So no, that would do it. And if you could get a time machine to go back about a month and frost seed that clover, that would be helpful. Now, if you look in the forecast ahead of us, you might see a few days, especially if you're further north, where it does freeze. So actually technical frost seeding can still work. So you're actually not too late to the game on that. And that would be clovers. Bag seed, a red bag seeder with clover seed. It's not much money. We're talking you could have the seed in it for less than $100. Mm-hmm. So frost seeding that, and even now, that clover seed is heavy and it's small, so it usually can get down to the soil. And I would say, is frost seeding more effective? Yes, because it sucks that when it thaws, freezes and thaws, it sucks that seed right up against the soil. And if you don't have that now, as long as you get it against the soil, I just seed it at a higher rate, because not as much of it is going to take as if you frost seeded, which gets it right against the soil. So just realize, hey, it's not quite as effective, but you could still broadcast now and it would come up. And if it doesn't, you're not out that much. And you could repeat this 2 or 3 times if you had to. And yeah, I'd say even now, after, if you say, hey, my frost is long gone, you could still get clover established. So yeah, a bag seeder and a sprayer. A sprayer would be nice.
Yeah.
You could get away without the sprayer.
Uh-huh.
But I probably wouldn't.
Okay, so what about the guy that's doing 2 to 5 acres? So it's a little bit more in size. Are there any other core pieces of equipment that they would want to prioritize?
I would probably get like a cultipack or a roller of some type, maybe a harrow, and this is like bare bones minimum. And you can do a lot with that. Now, you say, well, what can't you do with that? Well, clearly you can't do your large grains with that, like corn.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how deep does corn need to be? 2 inches, 2.5. How deep do beans need to be? Ideally, 1 to 2. Can you get away with beans more shallow? Yeah, you can. If you got a bean an eighth of an inch deep, it would be okay. Sometimes surface beans work. They just, it's not going to be ideal, but you could do that. So you're going to be limited on the big stuff, which isn't that big a deal. And then, yeah, a cultipacker, a harrow, and anything really. If somebody's like, hey, I found a little disc to scratch up the soil a little bit, just, that would be fine too. I mean, and if you shop around, you could find like a little disc that you're just going to lightly disc and a junky old cultipacker that you could fix up. I mean, you could be into that if you did it right, for under $1,000. I mean, some people, like, you can just have it and fix it up yourself.
Find it on a fence row.
Yeah. I mean, so a lot of this stuff that's like, hey, this is really small, so it's cheap. Well, if it's old stuff, nobody uses that. It's junk to them. Most of it's probably been scrapped out and recycled. But if you pay a little bit of attention, you'll find old discs and old cultipackers or cultimulchers, or I remember we found a little Brilliant seeder, which has a roller in front, a roller in back, and then in between it drops seed. And we bought that for like $500. It was old, rusty, and we had to put a little bit of work into it, but that did a fantastic job because it meters your seed. You can set the seed, and then, that front roller has a little bit of knobbiness or a little bit of, different ribs on it where it kind of makes a seed bed, drops the seed in there, and the rollers behind it pack those right in there. So it's a really great tool, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And again, somebody's like, well, he's missing this, he's missing that. I got that idea. There's 20 different ideas that would probably work just fine. So if I didn't mention the one that comes to mind for you, and this happens to be more like this is what I did, but yeah, there's a lot of different options for this. And I know some guys who are like, hey, I'm going to start out with that machine. I can't even remember what it's called, but it'll do everything in one pass, kind of like a drill, but it's cheaper. It's got the disc, and then it drops the seed, and then it's got a cultipacker behind it for food plots. I mean, that's fine. Now you're just talking a little bit more money. And at that point, I probably would rather save up for like a cheap no-till drill or something like that. But yeah, I mean, a million different ways to do this.
Yeah.
A million different ways.
I think the good point there is be resourceful. Look at Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, anywhere else where you can find the oldie but goodies. for
and that's how I probably had 75% of my equipment when I was doing it kind of Mickey Mouse. Is like, I'd look on Craigslist, and then I'd drive around, and I'd see sometimes I'd see a for sale sign, or sometimes I'd just see like junk, what they consider junk. Would you sell that? Yeah, we'll sell that. Yeah, I want that sprayer. All right, give me $50. And that's how we got that Brilliant. We were driving around. It was $500. And then I did buy a little 5-foot no-till drill that's 3-point for a little tractor. Little tractor could do it. Yeah, if you got a 4-wheeler or a truck or something, no, it's not going to work. But for a little tractor, I think that was $500. It was little, but it had 2 seed boxes on it, and it was no till. It's actually pretty handy. So when my buddies want to borrow things,
Yeah, you can borrow that.
there you go. If you break it,
Yeah, that's funny. So something that I want to ask too, there's some varying opinions on this, but what's your philosophy on having food on your farm 365?
100%. I do.
Non-negotiable.
Does everybody need to do that? No. Do I? Absolutely. Is there reasons I do this? Yes. Yes. It absolutely is a must if you're want to maximize your the use of your ground, the nutrition of your deer, the safety of your deer, keeping them safe, getting them a year older. 365 food is critical. And I know there's some folks that are like, hey, I don't want them in there in certain periods, and it's fine. They can have that opinion. And I'm not saying they're wrong. It's just, it's not what I do. I want 365, but I also, I'm doing it for nutritional needs. When these bucks have rutted really hard, and they're trying to replenish their system and they're run down, I want a grain there, and I want stuff like winter rye in the winter. And then right away in the spring, my winter rye still growing. It grew all throughout the winter, or my winter peas, stuff like that, and the grains. And I want my grains to run out about the time that my clover is greening up like this, and my rye is now about like this, a few inches tall. So the second it greens up and these bucks are still depleted, their skeletal systems are depleted, their body weight is depleted, their health is depleted, they're stressed out. They need maximum nutrition immediately. Now, another element of that is natural browse, which you can do a ton for that too, and I do. It's a huge component, huge natural browse. But 365 food, and so natural browse is part of that 365. Mm-hmm. And I could almost do it without plots. I mean, I really probably could. But I'm talking practical here and ideal too. So both practical and ideal, yes, you want plots too. And I want that green clover coming up the second that the snow is gone, and it's the first thing that greens up, and those deer will be on that like crazy. It's full of protein, it's full of nutrients, it's full of calcium, it's full of all these things the deer need to recover quickly. And right now, these bucks, you'll see like nubs like this. Well, all the nutrients are coming into their system. And in very simplistic terms, that buck is saying, the buck's body is saying, do I put that back into the skeleton because it's so depleted and I'm so downhill, or am I doing well there and now I can put it into the rack? Well, a healthy deer will be able to put it into his rack now and maximize his potential for rack. A deer that's run down, that didn't have good food, that just has very little browse and this is majorly stressed, they're going to put that back in their skeletal system. So the rack will be hindered because the buck's saying, what's the priority, a rack or my skeleton? It's the skeleton. So you want to just have as much food immediately in the spring and everything to get them through the winter. And that's why, going through your timber and starting timber stand improvement, and we can get into this now, or we can just get into it later. But that part, having that natural browse, is just gigantic. It's just gigantic importance. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so to answer your question, 365 food is critical, and that also is going to require a diverse set of plantings. And if somebody said, well, what's one thing that could do 365? What's one? And it's not going to be the best, but if somebody said, I can only do one, I still revert back to clover. They're digging it up in the winter. If you dig through the snow, a lot of times you'll see it's green. There's a few periods where maybe that's not there. It really went dormant, but it's probably going to be the one thing that is most available year round. And I would say, even compared to like alfalfa or a few other things people could list, I still say clover has the edge. And I'd say the winter desirability on clover is going to be better. And I've done this on my farm multiple times where I take a alfalfa field of mine that's great alfalfa, and then I put a little clover patch into it. And then I just watch what they eat. And then I look at where the sign is. And in the winter, the sign is all in that clover. and they're skipping past a lot of that alfalfa. Now I do see them eating alfalfa in the winter, but when they have clover next to it, my experience is that they will pick the clover over the alfalfa in the winter.
Interesting. And so here's another question for someone that has a smaller parcel. With quality browse and strategic food, do you think that a smaller parcel could carry the capacity to help a deer get through the winter with less stress? Or is it relative to the size of what you're able to, or the scale of what you're able to do? If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so let's just say you had 40 acres of timber, say all of it was timber. And you say, okay, starting out the year, my timber had 200 pounds per acre of natural browse. And I did the timber work properly, which is a whole long list. That's getting with a forester, executing a proper plan, stuff we've gone over before, complex, but very doable. In 2 or 3 years, you could say my timber now went from 200 pounds of natural browse per acre to 2,000 or 3,000 even. So you go, all right, 200 times 40, whatever that is, what is that, 8,000 pounds? And then you're taking that to 80,000 pounds, for example.
That's substantial.
It's substantial. Yeah, it's a game changer. It's a game changer that supports so many more deer, and it supports the health of the ones that are there. Even if you're like, hey, I'm not overpopulated, I don't have too many deer. Now they just have optimal nutrition, and I'd rather have a situation. This is more rare. This situation where you're like, hey, they have more browse than what they need. There's stuff extra left over. I'd rather have that situation versus the common situation across the country, which is like 90% of the country, which is like they do not have the proper browse. They don't. It's not managed properly. Now it's getting better with forestry management, with timber practices, and with people understanding these things. But yeah, you want too much as opposed to not enough. And just the fact that you have ample browse in your timber, you're in the top 5% of people right there by fixing that issue, and it's a huge issue.
Mm-hmm. Let's say out of 100 farms that you walk, how many of them actually have good high quality browse?
Very few, less than 5%.
Okay,
less than 5.
Yeah. So, and
the farms that they're like, hey man, I did really good TSI.
You're shaking.
Less than 5% of those are good TSI. They're not.
That's
so very few. I'd say in Iowa, very few. I mean, I rarely run into one where it's like, yeah, this is really dialed in for browse. It's just not. Most people haven't done a thing to it, and it's shaded out, and it's very minimal. So yeah, I'd say for sure less than 10%, so maybe 1%.
Wow.
So very, very little.
So if someone's thinking right now, well, I think I have pretty good browse, they should probably take a harder look at it just by the law of averages.
Yeah. So go to your field edge. And if you could even I don't know, I'm making this up. If you could stand on your vehicle and kind of look down at your field edge or where the timber is, and what you're going to see is you're going to see this gap from where all the trees are. And you're going to see this big wide open line where it's like, hey, there's leaves up here, and then you're going to see this line across the whole timbered edge where it's nothing. Yeah, they ate every bit of it. That's why there's this line. It's a definitive line, just like the skyline. When you look out, say, hey, look at that skyline. It's just a line right through there. You'll see that, and that's one indicator like, yeah, they browse this way down. Those deer clean it up. Mm-hmm. And, getting a little deeper into that rabbit hole, I'll open stuff up, and those deer will even pound that, and things will start to shade back in. Nature responds quickly. Nature fills in quickly. And I'll have to go back even later, a couple years later. I'll go through stuff that I'm like, in 10 years, I've gone through things 3-4 times, just touching them up a little. Ooh, I missed that. Or, yeah, that filled in a lot, and I want new successional growth there. So I did this TSI, 10 acres right here. I did this 5 years ago. Well, I'm going to go redo 2 acres of it. this year. And then a couple years, I'm going to do another 2 acres. And now in that 10 acres that I did at one time, I did 2 acres. And then I came back a couple years later, I did another 2 acres. So there's all these different successional changes, even within that piece of timber. And I know that's getting like, whoa, that's getting down the rabbit hole and micro, but it's not that complicated. All that's saying to somebody is just go back in your timber every couple of years after you finish your TSI. Well, first do it, and then just go back and you can touch things up, and then it's easy. You know, the hard work's done when you do a really quality timber stand improvement job, and then just go touch it up. And, you know, and if you know what like your junk trees are, like, hey man, I got a lot of bitternut hickory out here or whatever it is. Like in the winter, when it's a really hard winter, when everybody's sitting on their couch, I'll grab the chainsaw and be like, man, those deer are struggling a little bit. And I'll go out and I'll cut, 10 of those bitternut hickories or something, and I'll drop them. And you come back a day later and it looks like, oh my goodness. I mean, the deer traffic, it's like they ate the tops of the trees.
Yeah.
And they did. They'll eat the buds into the twigs. It looks like a corn pile. I did it this year, and I brought a buddy of mine back to help me finish this little section to show him. He's like, this looks like a giant, like what a giant corn pile would look like, except it's an acre with trees you dump down. It was just so good for him. I mean, they just went. And I did this a few times this winter, and I would drive past my trail camera. I'd be sawing. I'd have these 3 loud, obnoxious saws going. And I would drive out, and literally every time I did it, 5 and 10 minutes later, like I just left, and deer are going choop, 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 choop past my trail camera. They're not dumb. They get it. They understand, hey, it's January or February. We're not being hunted. And every time I've heard that chainsaw,
get a nice meal.
It's it's a meal. This is delicious.
Yeah. Well, I think that'll lead into some more. I have some specific scenarios to run into for TSI here in a little bit, but while we're still kind of talking about food overall for a farm, I want to ask you, what's the most overrated food source in your opinion? I'm going to put you in the hot seat here. Something that go ahead.
Trying to do one thing, like I'm just going to do brassicas. Do I like brassicas? Absolutely. Is it always going to be on my farm? Absolutely. Clover's maybe the only one where I'd be okay with that being my one food source, but just doing one thing. You say, hey man, I just did a soybean plot on my farm this year. It's fine. You fed the deer a little bit in the summer. You fed them a little bit in the fall, and then you're helping them late season. But there's a lot of windows in there where you did nothing.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a lot of days if you're like, well, I did it more for hunting. There's going to be a lot of days where that was ineffective for hunting because it's warm and they're not going to it. So doing one thing without diversity is overrated. A lot of the blends that are out there, they're just incorrect. They're not formulated right. The plants in them are not compatible. And I understand why they do it. Like, well, we don't know who's going to buy this. It could be a guy in Minnesota.
They're hedging their bet.
Could be a guy in northern Missouri. And we don't know if they're going to plant it 2 weeks late or 4 weeks early. We just got to put a bunch of stuff in there. So I think they even know that they're doing it incorrectly. But there's a lot of blends that are incorrect. There is some that are good. There's some great blends out there, and I don't have a problem with people buying things that are like, buck on the bag. I don't have a problem with that. Because, if you're like, well, if it's a good blend, hey, I spent $20 more to buy this buck on the bag. If it's a good blend, who cares? If you're doing an acre. If you're doing a lot of acres, I'll mix my own. And I generally just mix my own because I want to get the blends right. And I know when I'm going to plant them. I know what soil types I'm going to do. And I just make my own blends. But a lot of bad blends out there that are just incompatible. What do we hear here? Corn, soybeans, clover, brassicas, rye mixes. What am I missing?
We talked about brassicas. That's really the core ones there.
Yeah, those are all great.
Yeah.
They're all great. They all have their place. Just don't do just one of them.
Yeah, it's diversity.
Don't do just one.
Diversity is key. And so, what's to say for the guy? And you I think you maybe illustrated this, but your 2-acre plot, the secluded one, if there was a guy that only had 2 acres, would you think that field would have enough diversity to where that would be a great starting point? Probably not.
Oh, that's a huge start because nobody does that. Nobody with 2 acres plants 3 different things. And what I'm saying is, and we're even planting more than 3 different things. So absolutely, if you have 2 acres, this is the plot I would do. 100%. Leave 20%. And when I say 3 things, think about how many species I have in here now. So we have our 20% roughly. That's clover area. Within that clover, we have, I like 3 to 5 different clovers. So, there's 3 to 5 different clovers that serve different purposes, that are more desirable at certain times, more palatable at certain times, that all serve a purpose. Then, next to that, we have our brassicas, which could have either 2, 3, or 4 different types of brassicas. Some guys like even 5 or 6. And then next to that, we have a rye mix, which has 6, 7 different items in there. So really, I mean, we're over 10 different species that are being planted in one 2-acre plot. And they're all in different areas too, within that 2 acres. There's a divisible line. Okay, the clover ends. And here's where the brassicas start, and here's where the brassicas end, and here's where the rye starts. So if you have a plot with 3 diverse food sources in it, you're way ahead of it, and it's far better. In my opinion, it is vastly better. You will have a top-notch plot if you do something like that. And that's where I can't take the credit for this one. This is that, Doubletree from the Iowa Whitetail Forums. He started this one, and a lot of guys have copied it. And they kind of spun it a little bit and this and that. But it's the first I ever heard of that was 20 years ago or whatever it was from Doubletree. And it's genius, and it does work. I mean, there's been some things like, hey, I've tweaked this since then, or I've tweaked that since then. But I mean, fundamentally, the core foundation of why somebody would do that, that's an unstoppable plot. And until you get into that next tier, like, well, how do I integrate grain, like soybeans and corn and stuff like that? That's next level. But for a 2-acre plot, and I'm starting out, absolutely. If you can get that accomplished, you're rocking. You're in great shape. I mean, ideal plot.
Okay, that's tangible, and that's something that people can implement. So we're gonna do kind of a quick rapid fire here. I'm gonna put you to the coals here. You can only pick one species of each of these categories as your favorite. I know it's like picking your favorite kid. You can't. So, favorite clover. You can only your favorite. Most impactful.
Alice White. It's the most versatile clover for soil types. It's long lasting. It's cheap. It is probably the most desirable clover I've ever seen. It just does well on everything. It's fantastic. And I can't answer everything. I can't answer with one. So I'm just going to I don't know what to call. I'm going to filibuster here and throw in a few more things. Add a red, you could add Ladino, which is very similar to Alice White, but they're a little different. So I like adding Ladino as well. And then if there's any wetter soils, I like adding Alsike. And then if I plant anything in the spring, I like either adding Berseem or Balanza, probably Balanza, or even Crimson. And those 3 are annuals, very different plants. Crimson, Berseem, and Balanza are annuals. Ladino, Durana, which is like a really rough soil. That's a good one. Kopu 2, however you pronounce that one. Kopu 2, very good, and it has some attributes. This is just splitting hairs. So I'm totally going around your one.
No, that's good. There's still good info here.
I'm rolling over you here, so I'm sorry. So, but I want a red, medium red, fine. Ladino, Alice White, Alsike, and if I plant in the spring, pick one annual. Berseem, Balanza, or Crimson.
Okay. Pick
one of those 3. Do that blend. But yes, my number one's Alice White. Go.
Okay.
Next question.
Your favorite shrub. We haven't talked about shrubs at all, but you have to pick one of your favorites for whitetail habitat.
I'm going to go with, I've got 3.
Your favorite and then your 2 honorable mentions.
All right. I'm going to go with, I'm just going to go with wild plum just because it's harder for the deer to kill and it provides great cover. It spreads through the root systems. So it'll pop up over here. It'll sucker over there. So it spreads. It's very hard to kill. So I like that. And then it provides a fruit for all the critters to eat. That's a favorite, and deer don't mess with it. So I'd say that's number one. And then number 2 and 3 are hazelnut and dogwood. And I could go rhodosier dogwood, whatever. I mean, silky gray. The problem with hazelnut and the dogwood, they are like candy. The deer will eat them down, they munch them. And you go, where do I see hazelnut and where do I see the dogwoods? You're usually going to see them in the road ditches, and you're going to see them in these dense fence lines. Why is that? It's where the deer are not messing with them. You go plant dogwoods in the center of your farm, they're going to get hit.
So they're going to get just a tube them?
Not really tube them because, they're meant to come out shallow. I mean, it's a shrub.
Yeah.
I suppose you could tube them. The best way to probably do it would be to do the cheapest way you could build a little cage around them. And if somebody said, well, I want to do it large scale, like an acre, then again, like I said in the beginning, there's a million ways to skin this cat. There really is. Somebody could say, well, for food plots, we build an electric fence for our beans because they get wiped out. Okay, build an electric fence, make it more permanent, and a double layer electric fence, and put your shrubs in there and give them a few years and keep the deer out of there. Now, I've gone out through my farm and taken down old woven wire because I didn't have any money when I bought my first farm. And I made my own posts out of like hedge or...
Like chopping down trees and throw them in it.
Yeah, black locust or hedge, and then I grab all the T-posts, and then I do 2 layers of woven wire, and I'd encircle like a half acre or an acre area, and it took me a day, but I'd get the materials for free around the farm if you can, and then nothing can get in there. You're like, but that doesn't help my deer right now. No, it's a process. It's going to take some time, but at least they can live, because 90% of the time, hey, I'm just going to put them in the ground. And then they get eaten to the dirt.
Yeah.
And dogwoods and hazelnut and several other shrubs are like, oh my goodness, the browse that they get hit with. It's crazy. It's cool because you're like, they really like that. But the survival is very tough if they're not protected at some level. And somebody could go, well, he just mentioned a few things. Come up with there's a million ways to do it.
What about a shorter tube so they can still bush out, but they still don't get ate to the ground?
That would get, but again, you're still like, well, when they pop out of that tube and that tube's 2 foot off the ground, let's say it's 2 feet.
That's what I did. And they're all just mowed down right at the very top.
Yeah. Then they'll just they'll get a haircut every time they pop back there. So you have to add something to it. And here's a cheap one we've done is I went around my farm and I pulled T-posts out because all the cattle got booted. It's a really sad thing. I booted all the cattle. And so there's T-posts all over. So I just collected all the T-posts free, just my labor. And then my shrubs or whatever, I just went and bought a roll of woven wire. And I'd push it out and I'd cut a section. So, it's maybe, 3 foot in diameter, whatever it is, 3-4 foot in diameter. And I just tie it up. I put a T-post in and I just make a cage around that little shrub or tree or whatever. And I would rather see somebody do that and be like, well, I only did, because of that, it's more work. I only did 25 shrubs or 50 shrubs or 100 versus, no, I'm going to do 2,000 shrubs and I'm not going to protect them at all. I'd rather do less and protect them than more and not protect them, because even several thousand, they're probably still going to get killed. A lot of times they're going to be killed. So just protect them.
Okay. Some good insight in there. Okay. So wild plum, hazelnut, and dogwood. Why do you like the hazelnut? Just real quick, and then we'll move on.
The deer like the shrubs themselves. They'll nip on them and browse them. And then the hazelnuts are delicious for critters and for you, if you want to eat them. They're really good.
Okay. All right, so...
And they make good cover and all these things. Great cover. I mean, you look at it like, hey, that's really thick, brushy stuff. Man, looks like awesome deer cover. Yeah, that's shrubs. I mean, shrubs are fantastic deer cover, too.
All right, this is a fun one here, too. Favorite hardwood to plant. So to plant, this means it's not existing. You're going in there, today's a good day to plant a tree. This is what I want to plant.
I would say my favorite would be chestnut, and it would probably be either Chinese, which do not spread, they don't, or a 15/16, which is almost an American chestnut. It's 1/16 away from being an American chestnut. And so it's going to look like an American chestnut, but it's going to be blight resistant. And it's going to have great nut production. It'll be excellent. So that if you're like, hey, I'm more like want to get as close to American chestnut, which someday we might have the American chestnut back. We might, with all the research they're doing on blight resistance. But chestnut is fantastic. Don't think, hey, I'm going to go just plant a bunch of chestnuts and I'm going to have like a chestnut food plot and that's where I'm going to hunt every day of the season. It doesn't work like that. But I like that, and I'm still going to do the same thing. Man. I'm going to plant other hardwoods. I'm going to put a chinkapin oak in there. I'm going to put a dwarf chinkapin oak in there. And I have some oak hybrids that I like where I found a swamp white that hybridized with a burr, and I look at the acorns on these things and they're giant, and every time they drop, there's deer all over. It's crazy, and I've collected those. Started to grow those. I like, and they produce quick, like 5 years.
Really?
They can have, giant sweet acorns on them. So
where do you find those?
So chestnut's my one answer.
Where do you find those at?
So I found these at one of the state parks, and I do not know how they found it. I sent all this stuff. I'm like, I asked a few different foresters too. I'm like, what do you think this is? I'm like, it's definitely a hybrid. And my best guess is it's a burr mixed with swamp. And, like Missouri has a 3-way hybrid that they discovered. There's all sorts of weird stuff if you start looking. And then you're just like, well, okay, that's cool. It's a hybrid. That's a cool word. But do deer like it? Does it produce acorns early? Are they sweet? And there's a few examples that I found that, oh, yeah, it's awesome. Like one tree that was 10 years old, I bet it had 200-300 pounds of acorns on just one tree that was 10 years old. And I mean, they'd hit the ground and, a whole bunch would fall, and I go there the next day and there's just caps left. They cleaned them out.
Are those flood resistant still with it being a swamp oak, or can they get wet feet? Have you tried that?
Yeah, those will do pretty well. Wet ground, any wet ground, I would want to do a pin oak. I would want to do a swamp white. And then if you get a little further south, people do like chestnut oak and stuff like that. But, wet ground, pin oak's probably my favorite on wetter soils.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other honorable mention species of plants top to bottom that we didn't cover? And then otherwise we'll move on.
I was supposed to do one, and now you're giving me honorable mentions.
Well, it's like putting the coals to someone. Like you have to answer it. And then so
yeah,
you get to
I know.
it.
And I can do that too, but I'm still going to. Still gonna add to it. I would add the oak that is not on your property if you can find a good site for it. Like red oak grows on certain types of sites, like north-facing slopes. They do well on certain types of slopes. So if you're like, hey, I don't have any red oak, I would plant some red oak. If you're like, hey, I don't have any swamp oak, I plant some swamp oak. If you don't have white oak, I plant white oak. And that's your longest one where you're like, ooh, it's going to be a long time before it plants out acorns. I still do it. You got to do it. But if you're like, hey, my farm is full of bur oaks or whites or reds, and I want to do some areas that will have mass production for the deer, don't go add what you already have a lot of. If you're just like, hey, I want to create a forest, and I'm doing it for that reason, sure, add more of what you already have because it does well. But for deer reasons and for diversity reasons, plant what you're lacking. And there is most cases where you can plant the things you're lacking and they will do great. And there's a reason they're not there. Like, hey, I don't have white oaks, but they could do great here. Yeah, after the Great Depression and on, they wiped out your white oaks. It used to be there, but now it's not. Well, so white oaks can do well. And you're just trying to make that, make your farm more natural how it used to be. And get the white oaks back on it. So just plant the oaks you're lacking.